Hi everyone. Today I would like to talk to you about networking on a Linux server. So we're going to talk about how different distros or flavors will work with their networks. We're going to talk about how to monitor network settings, such as some emergency settings and what some of the common commands are that might be used. And we're going to talk about how to do some troubleshooting with some very basic networking issues on our server. So, unfortunately, networking is one of those things where it's pretty straightforward until it's not, and things have gone wrong and you don't know why. So, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the common things that have gone wrong, as well as some of the things that are always worth checking to make sure that everything is happening the way that we are expecting it to do. So, the first thing that I'm going to have you do is actually install the networking tools on one or both of your servers. It's called NetTools. Now, these networking tools are going to have a combination of some commands that are actually considered legacy, but you will actually still see a lot of people using them, and some commands that are helpful but aren't necessarily already prepackaged on your server. So it's worth having these, and then if you decide later that you never use them, that's fine, but I'm going to just have you start seeing what's out there. Now, when we talk about networking with distros, there's actually a huge amount of variability. In some cases, we actually go in and edit the config files, which you may have remembered from when we talked about dependencies, configuration, packages, and drivers. Networking has config files just like other things do. Sometimes you'll actually see the config file isn't written by a human, it's actually written by a script, and every single time you boot the system, that config file will get rewritten. So the thing that you're actually editing is your script. And sometimes there's actually a specialized app that you use to do networking. So what I would advise you to do is the two servers that you are working on, figure out how they do networking. Do they have an app? Do they have a config? Do they have a script? Are they doing something completely different? And then you'll be able to have a good baseline so you at least know what to start editing, because you don't want to start editing a config and then it turns out the config is actually being overwritten every single time you're rebooting the server. And even though we don't reboot our servers much, we really don't want everything to be lost necessarily when we do reboot. Now, some things that you should worry about first. So, IP addresses. Now, as a little refresher, we can have static or dynamic addresses. A static address is a fixed address, and a dynamic address is one that's just given to you. Now, one of the things that will happen on a server is most servers will have a static address so that we always know where we are going to be logging in so that we are always able to access that server and we don't have to, for example, go into our router to figure out the IP address of our server. So a lot of servers will have static addresses that they are assigned. Now, one of the things that you do want to remember is, of course, static addresses within a home network, so like the 10.10.10s or 192.168, is not the same thing as a public address. A static public address is something different and not necessarily what we're talking about here. You can also have static public addresses, and if you do things like own a website, you're probably going to want one so that you always know that your website, mywebsite.com, is always going to be pointed to the correct IP address for the server so the DNS will work properly. One of the things that you will see as an admin that is worth thinking about is having a static address that is assigned to your server admin so that you can actually go into your server and say, no matter what, I want this IP address to have access, or this IP address gets more access type of thing. So let's say something goes wrong, somebody has attacked our server, we have to shut it down, so we want to make it so that other people can't log in. Well, by other people, we mean people that aren't the admin of the server. So one of the ways that we can designate you are the admin of the server is that you were given a static address, and the server recognizes that static address from somewhere internal to the company so that no matter what, you can always get logged in. Some other things that we might have to think about with our server is setting the DNS. Did it come with one? Do we want to reset it? What are the interface names that we have set up? And are we going to be running IPv4, IPv6, or both? Now, in this particular time, the answer is generally both, but you will see a lot of people will commonly refer back to the IPv4 when they are doing things like going to the server for a web address or something like that. But it is worth making sure that you're thinking about, are you talking about V4, V6, or both? Are we running them both in parallel? Now, I'm going to use an example of networking in Red Hat here. And one of the reasons I'm using this example is because if you are using CentOS or the newer version Rocky, then that's actually originally from Red Hat. Red Hat is the company that creates this particular server distro. You can pay for support, which would get you an official Red Hat distro. If you are too cheap for that, like I am, then you might have unsupported CentOS. So in Red Hat, you can actually see we actually will have changes even from version to version. So it's not necessarily just the distro, Ubuntu or Debian or CentOS or whatever, that's going to have the networking changes. We might actually have networking changes version to version. So it's really important that you know the OS that you're running and you know the version that you're running. So in Red Hat 7, it used Red Network Manager. Red Hat 9 does as well. However, in Red Hat 7, in the etc init.d folder, there is a networking section, and that's where the networking information lived. But in Red Hat 9, it's in etc Network Manager System Connections. So if you didn't know which Red Hat version you're running, you might actually be looking in the wrong spot. Sure, they're all in the etc folder, but if you go look in the etc folder, it's not like there's only one thing in there. So it's worth thinking about version as well as operating system name. Now, one of the other things that has changed a little bit is in Red Hat 7, there was some systemctl start, stop, status things that you can use. Red Hat 9 actually has some other tools built in, so it's got systemctl and nmcli. So there's actually some more tools that they've built in. And you can see I've also linked to the documentation for both so that you can see some of the differences for managing networking just between two versions that frankly aren't really that far apart. I mean, one is 7, one is 9. Another thing to note, modification of any files in the networking packages or related RPMs, and they will no longer provide support. So if you are, for example, working for a company that did choose to pay for NetHat and you make changes to this, they won't support it anymore. So it's worth being aware of that so you can say, oh, I think I might need to go make a change. Well, I have to go talk to my support person, and then maybe they need to make that change instead of you. So these are just some things to think about with networking. Now, none of this is going to necessarily be related to what you are doing as you are going through these materials because it is not likely that you paid for Red Hat to do this. So you are most likely using a free unsupported version anyway. It's just things to think about going forward. Now, we can look at networking and Debian. So in the case of Debian or Debian, depending on how you want to pronounce it. In the etc folder, there's the networking interfaces, which is the config file, and something to make this more confusing. In the etc folder, we have something called resolve.conf for the name servers. However, resolve.conf is a program, and it's not the same thing as resolve.conf that works on the resolve.conf file. Resolve.conf is optional. Now, sometimes Naming schemes are a bit of a problem, so it is just making sure that you are being very careful what you're talking about. Resolve.conf being a program and being different than the resolve.conf file is important to make sure that you have that distinction. Now, technically in Debian, there is actually some automatic network config tools. There is a GUI, but that's not true on the server, so that's desktop only. And I did also link to the network configuration docs for Debian if you would like a little bit more detail about that. But this is something where you can see the difference of where the config file is, what the config file is for, in this case the name servers, and then a program which is going to be totally different than maybe the other programs that you're using. So it's why it's important to say, oh, are you using or are you running Debian? No? Well, then maybe you don't have this and you need to go look up for what you do have. Now, for an activity on one of your servers that's not the CentOS one, pull up networking information and I want you to start looking through the documentation. Now, if you have no idea where that is, that's completely fine. You can use Google for this, but I want you to start pulling up the config files. Are there scripts? Are there tools? Where is the documentation for your server? So if you picked one of the servers that I recommended, Ubuntu or Debian, there should be quite a bit of documentation out there. That's part of why I recommended those two for beginners. So you should be able to go find really quickly, what are you seeing? Where is it located? Is this a script being used? Is there a config file being used? Is there a tool being used? In the documentation, do you see a lot of special commands that are happening? And start making some notes about this for your server so that if you need to go find things again, you will know exactly where they are. It's always worth having these little written down notes for yourself. If this is something that you do all the time, you're probably not going to need the notes a whole lot. However, if this is something that you only do every 4 months, you might end up needing the notes more often. So make sure that you are writing things down and keeping it well organized. A very large text file that is just random words every now and then for 500 lines is probably not going to be as helpful for you. Now, the next thing that we're going to talk about is some legacy issues with networking. So one of the first things that you will see people do when we start talking about networking is, what's your IP address? Now, what's your IP address is a very reasonable first question to ask when we're networking because so much is reliant on the fact that you have one, it's unique to your system, and you know what it is. Now, originally, we actually used something called ifconfig. This is actually technically legacy. It's used to configure, display, and control networking interfaces. However, this is a big however, you will see this used a lot no matter what. Even though it's legacy, even though there's a new way to do it, even though some people could argue the new way is a better way, you will still see a whole bunch of admins that are absolutely convinced that ifconfig is the be-all and the end-all. So in this slide and on the website, I have linked a comparison between ifconfig and IP. It is worth learning how to do IP. That's the new way of what ifconfig used to do. IP, the command, has some more things that it can do. It's also on more systems by default. ifconfig is actually part of those network tools that you installed earlier in the first activity. But it's worth looking at a comparison. So maybe you've already done a little bit of work on a server, or you've done a little bit of troubleshooting, or you've already talked to somebody and they're like, oh yes, I always use ifconfig, or that's what you're comfortable with. So it's worth looking at how to do it using IP and seeing what you can get out of that. Now, some important commands to know. If you go to my website, I actually have links for each of these commands with example usage so you can actually see how each of these will work. These important commands, this list of commands, is some of the basics on how we're going to start trying to figure out what's going on in our network. Now, in some cases, it's going to be things like, what is the name of my computer? important thing to know. In some cases, it's going to be things like, how does my computer get from where I am to where Google is, and what path does it take? Stuff like that. So these important commands are ones that you should probably be familiar with, start practicing with, because these are some of the most common ones that you're going to be using as you go about doing some of your networking on your server. Now, for an activity, I want you to try some. So I want you to boot up your server and I want you to try some of these commands. Try ping, try ss, try tracepath, hostname. I have a link here for some Linux networking commands. Pick something else from that link that you haven't already tried and try that one out too. If you want examples because you don't necessarily know what format to use for these commands, completely fine. On my website, I have a list of each of the commands with a link to example usage. So like for example, ping. Most people know that ping has to have an argument. For example, ping Google. But let's pretend you didn't know that. If you go to the link, you'll actually see some examples of ping, some of the options that you can do, and what it's going to look like when it's working. If at any point you try these commands and it doesn't work, make sure that you read the error message carefully so that you can figure out what went wrong and how to fix it. Now we're going to talk about network troubleshooting. So when we talk about network troubleshooting, the first thing that I'm going to say is think back to your networking courses or your networking knowledge. Think about the OSI model and the TCP/IP model. Those layers is one way that we can go about troubleshooting. A second way that we can go about troubleshooting is making some guesses as to where the issue is based on the problem that we are having. So, for example, we could say, let's start troubleshooting by model layer. So we could start at the network access or physical layer, and we would start with, is the cable unplugged? Is the interface up? And we would check those first. Then we can move up to the data link layer. Did the ARP entry come up correctly? We can move up to the networking internet layer. Do you have a unique IP address? Is your DNS correct? We can move up to the transport layer. Is the correct port open for the application that we are using? Then we can go to the application layer. Is the program I'm trying to use installed? Is it updated? Is the daemon running? And we can ask these questions of the server in a rather methodical way based off of these layers from the OSI or TCP/IP model. Now, a second philosophy behind troubleshooting is we could start asking questions of ourselves and the server. So we can start looking at things like, let's start with, why am I unable to ping a known address? So am I able to ping anything? Is Google down? We could check that. We could look at, what is our error message? Do we have an error message? How did I figure out that my network or piece of network is down? What are some of the most common issues? Have I checked those common issues? If this is a server that has been up and running, another thing we can ask ourselves is, what changed from the last time I used this machine? So if the machine was working last week and it's not working now, what changes have happened in the last week? Have you done installs, updates, upgrades? Have you added or taken away anything? Has anything changed in your network? And so you can ask yourself and the server these types of questions to start trying to figure out what's going on. And making sure that you are reading the error messages, checking the logs, and all of those things to make sure that we are able to follow along and figure out what's actually happening. So those are some of the basic troubleshooting steps that we can take for network troubleshooting on a Linux server. The last activity that I am going to have you all do today is come up with some scenarios, come up with some ideas for the given scenarios. For example, there's no internet access for anyone at the whole company. Come up with some ideas about why that might be happening. There's internet access everywhere but the server. What are some reasons or ideas on why that might be happening? You can access the internet from your server, but you can't ping or SSH into the server. Come up with some ideas or issues that might be happening. Refer back to some of the other slides and articles that I've given and try to really think about what some scenarios are for why you could be coming up with these errors. What could possibly cause these problems? And that is the end of networking. I hope you are all doing well, and I hope to talk to you again soon.